Es darf nach der Bundestagswahl keine Mehrheit für CDU, CSU und AfD geben, sonst droht uns eine schwarz-blaue Regierung in Deutschland.
Es kommt eine Zusammenarbeit von uns mit der AfD nicht in Frage. Es kommt nicht in Frage und dabei wird es natürlich auch bleiben. Und Sie wissen das auch. Sie wissen das natürlich auch.
Sparks are definitely flying and speculation is running wild. Who will actually govern after the election? Will the far-right AfD make it into power as part of a coalition? Or will Merz and his conservative CDU-CSU hold their word and govern with the center-left? Let's take a look at our main contenders and the latest polling averages. Leading the pack with 31% is Friedrich Merz and his center-right CDU-CSU coalition. This represents a 6.8 percentage point increase from their election result in 2021. Right behind him, with 20%, is Alice Weidel from the far-right AfD. In third place is Olaf Scholz from the center-left SPD with 14.9%. Coming in fourth, the center-left Greens with Robert Habeck at 13.5%. Fifth place, the far-left Die Linke at 6.2%. Sixth, the economically left but socially right-wing BSW at 4.4%. And finally, in seventh place, Christian Lindner's centrist FDP at 4.2%. The outgoing government is known as the Traffic Light Coalition, made up of red SPD, yellow FDP, and of course, green for the Greens. As you can see, they aren't exactly thriving in the polls. And here's where it gets super interesting. Germany has a 5% threshold, meaning any party that falls below it generally gets 0 seats in the parliament. So if these polls hold, the FDP and BSW would be completely out. That leaves us with a big question. Who forms the next government? To win outright, a party would need 316 seats out of 630. But look at these projected seats based on the last 5 polls. No one's even close. So coalitions aren't just optional, they're a must. And if the CDU-CSU get the most seats, as projected, they get the first dibs on forming a government. But with whom? Now that's the million-euro question, and in this video we are going to speculate what could happen. Option 1, a CDU-CSU-AfD coalition. This is a nightmare scenario for Scholz, and to be fair, all the mainstream parties. If it were to happen, the numbers would be there though. 375 seats, a very solid majority. And let's be honest, on some topics like migration, CDU, CSU and AfD do share some hardline positions, particularly on border controls and deportations. But is this scenario actually likely though? Let's hear from the man himself.
Dass wir mit der AfD zusammenarbeiten. Ich will das ausdrücklich hier noch einmal klarstellen. Wir werden das nicht tun. Uns trennen in den Sachfragen Welten, was Europa betrifft, die NATO betrifft, den Euro betrifft, Russland betrifft, Amerika betrifft. Es gibt keine Gemeinsamkeiten zwischen AfD und Union.
I mean, it really doesn't get any clearer than that, does it? But here's the counter-argument. Merz has backtracked on his word before. He once claimed he wouldn't rely on AfD votes to pass legislation. Yet following multiple terrorist attacks in Germany, he did just that, receiving AfD support for tougher anti-migration measures in parliament. Some argue this is the first crack in Germany's cordon sanitaire, the unwritten rule that mainstream democratic parties don't cooperate with extremists. And to be honest, this wouldn't just be a one-off case. Just look at Europe. In the Netherlands, the far-right is already part of the government. And in Austria, the far-right FPÖ has actively pursued a coalition with the center-right ÖVP. So could this happen in Germany too? In our eyes, it's highly unlikely. Public opposition is overwhelming, and Merz's CDU-CSU has long positioned the AfD as its biggest political enemy. Bottom line, this coalition is 99% off the table. This brings us to option 2, a CDU-CSU Greens coalition with 327 seats, making it a workable majority. And on some key issues, CDU-CSU and the Greens actually align. They both support a strong EU, backing Ukraine and taking a hard stance on Russia. But when it comes to social policy and the environment, that's where things get a bit tricky. And on migration, CDU-CSU takes a much tougher stance than the Greens. The biggest roadblock though, it comes from Bavaria, one of Germany's most powerful states. Markus Söder, the Bavarian minister-president and leader of the CSU, the CDU's sister party, is deeply opposed to this coalition. And when it comes to Robert Habeck, the Greens' lead candidate, it feels personal.
Sorry, das ist einfach inkompetent. Robert Habeck kann keine Wirtschaftspolitik. Warum soll Robert Habeck weiter in der Regierung bleiben? Mit der CSU gibt es kein Schwarz-Grün, kein Robert Habeck mehr als Wirtschaftsminister. Am besten bitte in die Opposition, denn da gehören die Grünen hin.
That's a very hard no from the CSU. But here's the catch. Söder's influence is strong, but not absolute. If Merz really pushes for this coalition, the CSU could fall in line, yet very reluctantly. So while not impossible, a CDU-CSU Greens government is looking unlikely. Now before we jump to the next option, a quick shout out. Join our Discord community. We've got a super active, passionate group of over 500 people deep in debates and analyzing the latest polling data on the German election. In fact, this very video was made possible thanks to insights collected from our Discord discussions. Come and join us. The link is in the description below. Alright, on to option 3. A CDU-CSU SPD coalition with 338 seats, a comfortable majority. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it is. Out of Merkel's 16 years in power, 12 were spent governing with this exact coalition. Sure, Scholz and Merz have spent the last couple of years ripping into each other, but their latest TV debate? Surprisingly tame, almost as if they were keeping the door open. Policy-wise, there are hurdles though. Migration is a major sticking point, but the biggest battle? Spending and debt. The CDU-CSU want to cut bureaucracy and government spending to finance tax cuts, military investment, and Ukraine support. Meanwhile, the SPD insists on protecting social programs like the Bürgergeld initiative and wants to borrow more, pushing to reform Germany's debt brake, something the CDU-CSU doesn't really like. But despite these differences, if the polls hold, this coalition looks like the most likely outcome. But, and this is a very big but, all of our analysis so far assumes that the polls don't change, and that the FDP and BSW remain below the 5% threshold. But what if that doesn't happen? Take the BSW for example. They're hovering right near the 5% mark. If they make it into parliament, it could dramatically shift the political landscape. If all other numbers stay the same, here's what happens. Option 2, CDU-CSU and the Greens, is no longer possible. Their combined seats would fall below 315, meaning no majority. And option 3, CDU-CSU and SPD, this still works, but just barely, with a razor-thin 4-seat majority. Now, imagine the FDP also makes it in. That would mean neither option 2 nor option 3 is viable anymore, forcing Germany into a 3-party coalition. And given how well that worked last time, well, let's just say the last one collapsed. In this scenario, the most probable outcome would be the so-called Germany coalition, made up of the CDU-CSU, SPD, and the FDP. This makes most sense, because FDP and CDU-CSU have significant policy overlap, especially on economic and fiscal issues. And then there is a scenario that throws everything into chaos. Let's say the BSW makes it in, but the FDP doesn't. And at the same time, the CDU-CSU loses just 2% to, let's say, the AfD. Sounds unlikely? Well, it really isn't, as some polls already put the CDU-CSU lower and the AfD higher. And if that happens, the CDU-CSU-SPD coalition no longer has a majority. So what then? The most likely outcome would be a Kenya coalition, the CDU-CSU, the SPD, and the Greens. This will require some serious political flexibility. These 3 parties have starkly different priorities, and getting them to agree on a governing program would be, let's just say, very complicated. It might even result in a minority government if talks fail. So those are the 5 possible coalitions we see for Germany after the election. But which one do you think works best for the country? Let us know in the comments. And in our opinion, Germany would do well to avoid a 3-party coalition. Especially option 5, because it risks complete gridlock. And with so many pressing challenges in Germany, Europe, and globally, we need a government that is strong, decisive, and capable of getting things done. If you want to dive deeper into what the next German Chancellor is planning for Europe and beyond, check out our in-depth analysis here, where we break down their entire foreign policy, plans for the EU, security and defense, and Ukraine. And once again, to support us further, please consider joining Patreon. Every contribution helps us bring you more in-depth discussions on Europe's future. Thank you so much to our presidents, Jan, Sjoukje, Christian, Peter, AGVD, and BJ. See you in the next video.